When ISIS rose, the world focused on its fighters and ruthless leaders. But behind them stood the wives. And as the caliphate collapsed, these women discovered that their husbands' power could not save them. What followed was vengeance and an end as brutal as the terror they once lived beside. It started when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared the ISIS caliphate in Mosul on June 29, 2014. His words were not just for fighters. His speech called for men and women to join what he described as a new Islamic empire. The announcement spread quickly through social media, videos, and propaganda magazines. Within weeks, men were pouring into Iraq and Syria from all over the world. And with them came women, wives, brides, and widows of jihad. Some of these women were already married to ISIS fighters before the caliphate was declared. Others traveled from places as far as Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia to become jihadi brides. Online recruiters promised them a life of dignity, purpose, and religious duty. In reality, many of them were stepping into a life of control, fear, and violence. In cities like Mosul, Raqqa, and Fallujah, ISIS seized homes, schools, and even hospitals. The wives of commanders and fighters moved into these stolen houses. They often lived in relative comfort compared to the starving local population. While ordinary families struggled to find food, some ISIS wives had access to electricity, water, and supplies brought in through smuggling networks. Not all women had a choice in this life. Many Yazidi and Christian women were taken as captives, forced into marriages with ISIS leaders. For them, the title of wife meant slavery. They were controlled, abused, and stripped of freedom, treated as part of the spoils of war. Among the loyal wives, some became more than just silent partners. They played active roles in the system of terror. In Raqqa, female police units known as the Al-Qansah Brigade were made up mostly of ISIS wives. They patrolled the streets, making sure women wore full black coverings, and punished anyone who broke the rules. Punishments could include lashings, imprisonment, and even execution. These wives were feared almost as much as their husbands. By 2015, intelligence agencies estimated that more than 4,700 foreign women had joined ISIS across Iraq and Syria. They came from countries like Tunisia, France, Germany, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Some were as young as teenagers. Others were widows of earlier conflicts who saw ISIS as a chance to start over. Their fates became tied to the rise of the men they married. But as ISIS expanded, so did the number of its enemies. The wives believed they were protected by their husband's power. They did not realize that the same rise that gave them comfort and authority would soon bring destruction. And that destruction began in 2016, when the so-called caliphate was no longer growing. It was shrinking. Cities that ISIS had once controlled with an iron grip began to fall one after another. The most important battle started in October 2016, the fight for Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city. The Iraqi army, Kurdish forces, and coalition allies surrounded Mosul step by step. Airstrikes hit supply lines, bridges, and ISIS checkpoints. Food and medicine became harder to find. Ordinary families were trapped in their homes, and the wives of ISIS leaders suddenly found themselves in the middle of a siege. Inside the city, loyalty began to crack. Wives of commanders like Abu Abdul Rahman al-Bilawi and Abu Muslim al-Turkmani tried to disguise themselves as civilians and escape, but people recognized them. Many locals had lost brothers, fathers, and children to ISIS executions, and they were filled with rage. When these wives were caught, some were beaten to death on the spot. For the victims' families, this was revenge. For the women, it was a brutal end to years of privilege. Mosul's old city became the hardest battleground. The narrow alleys were packed with families hiding in cellars and basements. Women clutched their children while bombs fell from the sky. Some begged Iraqi soldiers to spare them, hoping their children could survive even if they themselves were punished. But others made a different choice. A number of ISIS wives strapped on suicide belts, waiting for the moment soldiers entered. They blew themselves up, killing not only the advancing troops, but also anyone nearby, including women and children. Their deaths did not come in the way they imagined. There was no honor, no safety, no protection. Their last hours were spent in dark cellars, with explosions overhead and fear all around. While Mosul was crumbling, Raqqa in Syria became the beating heart of ISIS. From 2014 until 2017, it was their self-declared capital. This was where orders were given, where propaganda videos were made, and where many of the group's most powerful leaders lived with their families. By 2017, however, Raqqa itself was under siege. The Syrian Democratic Forces, backed by heavy U.S. airstrikes, had surrounded the city. For the wives of ISIS leaders, Raqqa became a cage. The city was overcrowded. Thousands of ISIS fighters had moved their families there, believing Raqqa was the safest stronghold. Mansions, government buildings, and stolen homes were filled with wives and children. Some women lived in relative comfort, with food and supplies smuggled in. Others were trapped in crumbling houses, hiding from the bombs that shook the city daily. One of the most well-known ISIS leaders in Raqqa was Turki al-Bin Ali, a cleric from Bahrain who had risen to become the group's chief religious scholar. His wife and children lived with him in Raqqa, moving from one safe house to another. When an airstrike killed al-Bin Ali in May 2017, his family's life changed instantly. The widow tried to escape with her children, but she was quickly caught. Kurdish fighters found her hiding in underground tunnels, the same kind of tunnels many ISIS families used as their last refuge. Other women never made it that far. As the siege tightened, civilians who had suffered under ISIS rule saw their chance for revenge. They knew which houses belonged to ISIS leaders. Wives suspected of being connected to commanders were dragged from hiding places. Some were beaten in the streets. Others were burned alive in public squares. Years of terror had turned into an explosion of anger. By 2018, the caliphate was falling apart everywhere. One city after another slipped out of ISIS control. What was once a vast empire across Iraq and Syria had shrunk to patches of desert and broken towns. Deir az-Zur, a province in eastern Syria, became one of the last hiding places. Fighters, their wives and children, crammed into small villages along the Euphrates River, moving constantly to escape bombs and advancing troops. For the women, life was now stripped of the luxury they once had. Many ended up in detention centers like Al-Khol and Roj, guarded by Turkish forces. These camps quickly filled with tens of thousands of women and children. Life inside was unbearable. The ground was muddy in winter and scorching in summer. Food was limited, often just bread, rice, or lentils. Clean water was scarce, and disease spread fast through the tents. Mothers struggled to keep their children alive, while many babies died from malnutrition or infections that went untreated. Among the women trapped were foreign recruits, including the young British girls who had left London in 2015, the Bethnal Green girls. By 2018, some of them had become widows, while others were still raising children fathered by ISIS fighters. Their lives had gone from school uniforms in London to rags in the dust of Syria. They were not alone. Thousands of women from Europe, Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East were in the same camps, unwanted by their home countries, and despised by locals who saw them as the faces of ISIS cruelty. Not all women made it to the camps. On the front lines, Syrian soldiers and rival militias showed little mercy. If they found out a woman was the wife of a senior commander, the punishment was often instant death. Some were executed in front of their children. Others were dragged away and never seen again. The chaos made it impossible to count how many were killed during this period. But stories of women shot in villages or left behind in mass graves became common. By March 2019, The war against ISIS had reached its final stage. The once powerful caliphate that stretched across 2 countries was now reduced to a single village, Baghouz, in eastern Syria. This dusty settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River became the last stronghold for thousands of fighters and their families. The world's most feared terror group was trapped in a patch of land less than 2 square miles. The situation inside Baghouz was desperate. Wives of ISIS fighters lived in makeshift tents built from blankets, plastic sheets, and scraps of metal. Smoke from constant airstrikes filled the sky, and gunfire echoed through the fields. Food and water were running out. Children cried from hunger. Mothers dug shallow holes in the dirt to protect their babies from shrapnel. Every day felt like the end. American drones circled above, watching every move. On the ground, Kurdish fighters from the Syrian Democratic Forces slowly advanced, cutting off escape routes. Wives of senior leaders, like Abu Hassan al-Muhajir, ISIS's spokesman, were cornered with no way out. Some of these women carried rifles, ready to fight alongside their husbands. Others clutched their babies, hoping to survive the storm that was closing in. The final assault was brutal. Airstrikes pounded Baghouz, tearing apart tents and shelters. Hundreds were killed in a matter of days. Many women refused to surrender. Some strapped suicide vests to themselves. Others tried to run across the open desert, only to be gunned down by fighters who saw them as dangerous threats. There were also women who chose to end their lives on their own terms. One report described a group of wives setting themselves on fire inside a tent, rather than face capture. To them, surrender was worse than death. For others, the choice was taken away. Bombs fell without warning, and families were buried where they sat. When Baghouz fell on March 23, 2019, the ISIS dream ended. But for the wives, their nightmare had only begun. After Baghouz, more than 60,000 women and children were sent to detention camps in northeastern Syria. Families had to live in thin tents that offered little protection from the freezing winters and burning summers. Water was dirty, food was limited, and medical care was almost impossible to find. The camps also became breeding grounds for anger and revenge. Some women remained deeply loyal to ISIS and refused to accept defeat. They formed hidden groups, enforcing their own strict rules inside the fences. Any woman who spoke against ISIS or tried to leave the ideology was seen as a traitor. These loyalists carried out brutal punishments. In 2019 alone, more than 80 murders were reported at Al-Hol. Many of them women stabbed to death in their tents or strangled at night. Even guards were attacked with knives and smuggled weapons. Children in the camps grew up surrounded by violence and fear. Many never went to school and had no toys or safe places to play. Instead, they listened to mothers telling them about martyrdom and revenge. Aid workers warned that these camps could raise a new generation filled with the same hatred that fueled ISIS in the first place. The world looked away, but the suffering inside these fences showed that even though ISIS had lost its land, its shadow still lived on. In Iraq, the hatred left behind by the group was overwhelming. They had killed thousands, destroyed whole neighborhoods, and left behind countless mass graves. When they finally lost power, the anger of ordinary people boiled over. In towns like Tikrit, Fallujah, and Mosul, families of victims did not wait for courts or the government to act. They wanted their own revenge. Many locals believed that the wives were not innocent. Some had helped their husbands recruit, collect money, or even point out neighbors who resisted. Even if a wife had no role, her connection to ISIS made her a target. By 2017, stories spread of women being dragged from their homes or from refugee camps and punished in public. One case in Tikrit showed the full force of this anger, where a widow of an ISIS emir was pulled into the street by families who had lost sons and brothers to ISIS firing squads. She was stoned to death as the crowd shouted. In Fallujah, scenes of revenge were recorded and shared online. Videos showed women in black robes, lined up against walls, executed by firing squads after only minutes in front of makeshift judges. These trials were quick and harsh. There was no time for defense or appeals. For many Iraqis, prison wasn't enough. They had lived through years of terror, and now they believed only death could balance the scales. In Mosul, locals attacked anyone linked to the group. Women suspected of being ISIS wives were beaten in the streets, their houses set on fire, or handed to militias who carried out swift executions. The brutality reached a point where even human rights groups admitted they could not count the exact number of women killed. This was revenge without limits. But not every ISIS wife was killed in the streets. Some were captured and taken into courtrooms. In Baghdad, the Iraqi government decided to show no mercy. Between 2018 and 2020, hundreds of women stood trial. Many of them were not Iraqi. Some had come from countries like Russia, Germany, France, and even the United States to marry ISIS fighters. Now, far from home, they faced Iraqi judges who carried the weight of years of bloodshed. The trials were fast and unforgiving. Most lasted less than 10 minutes. There were no long defenses, no detailed questioning. Judges usually had a single question, asking whether they were married to an ISIS fighter or not. If the answer was yes, it was almost always enough for a death sentence or life in prison. For the courts, the marriage itself was proof of loyalty to ISIS. The punishments were real and public. In 2018, a Russian woman, only 20 years old, was executed in Baghdad after admitting she had joined her husband in Mosul. In 2017, a German woman was also sentenced to death for supporting ISIS and living under its rule. Dozens of others from France, Turkey, and Central Asia faced the same fate. For Iraq, these women were not victims. They were seen as part of the machine that had killed thousands of Iraqis. Even those who escaped execution did not truly escape punishment. Life in Iraqi prisons was brutal. Torture and beatings were common. Many women died in prison long before their sentences could be carried out. For them, the prison itself became a slow death sentence. For the women who came from faraway countries, their own governments refused to take them back. Officials in Paris, London, and Berlin said they were too dangerous to return, and that they should stay in Syria or Iraq to face justice there. By 2019, reports showed more than 7,000 foreign wives and children were trapped in Syrian camps. Many had already lost their husbands, who were killed in battle or blown apart by airstrikes. Others had seen their men captured and executed. Left behind, the women had no country to return to, and no way to move forward. Some of the women tried to find ways out. Smuggling networks grew inside and around the camps. For large amounts of money, smugglers promised to sneak them across borders into Turkey or back into Iraq. A few managed to escape, but many were caught along the way and either sent back to the camps or killed. Others didn't even make it that far. Guards often opened fire on women trying to run. The families of ISIS's top leaders carried the weight of their husbands' names. And for enemies of ISIS, that alone was enough to seal their fate. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi blew himself up during a U.S. Special Forces raid in Idlib on October 26, 2019, the shock was felt worldwide. But the story did not end with him. His surviving wives were soon captured. They became trophies in a dangerous game. Rival militant groups did not want them alive. Some were quietly executed, their bodies left in secret graves, so that no trace of Baghdadi's bloodline could survive. The same pattern repeated with his successor, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi. On February 3, 2022, U.S. forces stormed a safe house in Atmeh, a town near the Turkish border. Qurashi detonated a bomb, killing himself, his children, and his wives in an instant. Their bodies were crushed under the rubble. For the world, It was another blow to ISIS's leadership. For the families inside, it was a brutal end, without dignity, buried in dust and blood. Today, the wives of ISIS leaders are scattered across graves, prisons, and dusty camps. Few remain alive. Most met their last hours in pain and terror.